I'm changing roles for a little bit. I'm moving on temporarily as your MC for the afternoon to be moderating this panel that's presented by American Marketing Association Los Angeles. And I've been looking forward to having this panel for a really, really long time. I'm going to have each panelist give their name and their current position, and we'll go from there. Thorin.
Cool. Hi, my name is Thorin Stevens. I'm the Chief Digital Officer at American Apparel.
I'm Kate Edwards, and I am the co-founder of Heartbeat Media.
Hello. There we go.
Let's try it.
Hey, take two. Sam Levine, Vice President of Brand Partnerships and Business Development at Fuel Industries.
Okay, so as everyone knows, this panel is on reaching the unreachables. And the question I had when I was doing my research is, what is a millennial? According to Iconoclast, a consumer research firm, the first millennials were born in 1978. Newsweek magazine reported that the millennial generation was born between 1977 and 1994. In separate articles, the New York Times pegged millennials at 1976 to 1990 and 1978 to 1998. A Time magazine article placed millennials at 1980 to 2000. So much for consistency. So my first question to the panelist is, what is a millennial? And Thorin, let's start with you.
Sure, so I was born in 78, and I was actually terrified to learn that I might be possibly classified as a millennial. First and foremost, so millennials typically in that age bracket, 25 to 35, so to speak, is how we would typically frame that demo.
Yeah, I agree. I think, the ages can range a little bit, but, when we work with millennials, and at Heartbeat we work specifically and only with millennials, we really define them as people who are digital natives, if you will, even though I hate that phrase, but people who have grown up with technology, who live it and breathe it, and we also categorize them as a sense of people who are more globally conscious and aware. They're really involved in the world around them. And for that reason, they feel like they, have a right to and can be involved with and engage with brands.
Yeah, I think building on that, there's some interesting psychographics and behavior patterns that are typically associated with millennials. We say that our demographic is millennials, kids, and family, but that's mostly because the people who we're working with need some classifications. We actually say Generation Play is who the demo is because it's anyone who's actively engaged with content. And then once you look at that from like the top down, what happens is then based on what you're trying to accomplish, you start getting smaller and smaller, more finite targets, right? So it's like, is it brand love that you're trying to focus in on? Is it a behavior pattern you're trying to focus in on? Is it, because the millennial thing, there's so many different ways to answer it. I was reading some stuff the other day that was talking about millennials based on their living arrangements, right? They're like classifying millennials based on the subsets of the ones who are still living at home versus living out by themselves, or living out with friends versus living out on their own, right? As a way to look at millennials. So there's a lot of ways to look at it. We just kind of say Generation Play, and then we base kind of our target. Our target goes from
right.
there.
So really drilling down to that particular subset that you're trying to reach.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think Thorin tapped into something that's really interesting, which was this fear of being the millennial. I feel that too. And I mean,
I don't,
like,
just for the record.
How many people in this room identify as millennials? Like, raise your hand if you would consider yourself a millennial. Okay, so that's like a decent amount. But I think there is this dread of being the millennial, and so when you're communicating with them, it's a little strange. You have to be a little cognizant of, okay, do they want to be called a millennial? Are they not a millennial? Do they want to be Generation Z? Do they want to be? They probably don't want to be Generation X. So kind of identifying them and then being afraid of calling them what they are is a challenge.
I think the hard part there is that the same things that people would like kind of shy away from is also what makes them a really powerful group. They talk about how they, like on the negative side, they talk about being entitled, right? Which is really hard classification to try to live up to. It's like, I don't want to be entitled, but the reality is that just means that you have value for your action and value for your attention. So you can identify that there's a value exchange. They're super easy to talk to, right? But it's like the things that make millennials negative is also what makes them super powerful if you can play into that.
And reaching them. And just for the record, I wrote an article as to whether I was a boomer or an Xer, so I don't identify with the millennial thing at all because I was born in 19... Sorry. So the next thing I want to talk about is data integration structure with your company and how it does affect millennial targeting. And Thorne, I'd like to start with you on this.
Sure.
And tell us, I realize we have brief time here, but a little bit about what you're doing at American Apparel.
Definitely.
And then Kate and Sam, I'd love for you to weigh in on how your firms integrate data and analytics.
Sounds good. So one of the most fundamental metrics we use is, I would say, CLV, or customer lifetime value. That's kind of the cornerstone. And so that's not segmented by millennials initially, but that's usually where we start. So understanding what is the value ultimately of the consumer down to the contribution margin basis. And then from there, we're able to segment based on additional dimensions such as age, such as demo, such as so on and so forth. So that's really the foundation of the approach. And then we look at the flip side of the value of the consumer and also the perception of the value of the brand in the eyes of that consumer. So we look at metrics such as Net Promoter Score. And then sometimes we can correlate the two and build models off each.
So what I'm hearing already is that also from Thorne's perspective is that we're drilling down into subsets, right?
For sure.
Kate?
Yeah, so Heartbeat uses data every single day. I mean, it's really important to what we do. So just for a little bit of background, Heartbeat is a company, we reward millennial women for being themselves on social media. So we connect them with brands that are relevant to them, that they already love, and we can kind of, create on-demand brand ambassadors for brands. So I know American Apparel has an amazing group of brand ambassadors. We can do that type of thing for brands who are looking to build that. But what we use data for and how we use it every day is we're always trying to learn more about these women. And one of the cool things about data for us is that they are telling us who they are, what they want. I think millennials are way more willing to give data. They are required to link their Instagram to be part of our team. They're required to link their Facebook. They willingly give us access to their Vine, their Snapchat, everything, their Pinterest. Because they want us to know as much as possible about them. And I think that's really unique for their generation is privacy, we see at least, is much less of a concern. And they're actively willing to share, who they are. And so we're able to use that, but of course it's only with their permission.
Yeah, I think data it's an interesting question. I mean, at the end of the day, there's so much data out there that from our perspective, it's meant to kind of reinforce insights, and it's meant to kind of drive creative. There's so much data out there that if you haven't done your due diligence and figured out what data is available and everything you could possibly find, data keeps you from failing. Let's just be straight about it. There's so much data out there that it's a lack of preparedness if you're going into the marketplace without a ton of data. And then from that data, you now have this really nice invisible box to play in, because if you've done your due diligence, you have enough data, you shouldn't fail. Now, creative can be subjective, and there's plenty of things you can't control, but if you have enough data, you should be able to back all your data, all your creative and all your strategy into these really clear lanes and pathways and activation points and platforms and targets and all kinds of stuff. I mean, data's there to keep you from failing miserably. And when you have great data, it's an amplifier. It allows you to make decisions and spend money and choose things that are gonna escalate everything. So it's just such a critical piece if you're not accessing it in really in really depthful, insightful ways, then you're doing yourself and whatever you're trying to accomplish a huge disservice.
Sure. So maybe some other examples of taking action from the data. How many people here in the audience are using custom audiences? So maybe about half or so. Of course, Facebook was really one of the pioneers here, and the concept is you have your known users, and there's maybe 3 to 4 different variables you can pivot on. It could be first name, last name, email, it could be phone number, it could be device ID. But essentially, you can upload that data into Facebook, and you can target them accordingly. Google has a similar product. You can now do it on Twitter, so on and so forth. But my point is, At this day and age, and then actually the other side would actually be programmatic, and you can do similar customer segmentation and targeting there. And so just through the use of having essentially the age as a variable within your broader CRM strategy, you can actually pivot and target those consumers quite readily through any of the various major media providers.
So if you've noticed, we have a little bit of a theme here where we've been talking throughout this conference about you got the data, but if you don't interpret it, if you're not using it correctly, you're wasting it.
Very
right.
Yeah. And very common.
Yeah. I can get, because it's always changing, right? And that's something I mentioned earlier in the day, was that you have to stay educated about it because it is changing on a daily basis, right? So, and I know this is a kind of a broad way to look at it, and we've started to answer this question, but when you're starting a new campaign, is there some fundamental aspects of that campaign that is targeting millennials or a specific subset of millennials that you automatically include when you're starting a campaign? So, Sam, why don't we start with you and work back this way?
I mean, the easy answer is yes. Like I said, you do a huge discovery phase, you get tons of data. The data should create really clear insights as to the people you're trying to reach and the things that they value. But I don't know that there's anything consistent beyond the process, because whether it's a brand, and we work with brands as different as the NFL and the NASCAR, to Warner Brothers and DC Comics, to Salesforce and Microsoft, right? Totally different brands, and all these brands are trying to target the same people, millennials, right? But how they go about doing it's different. When you're talking to tech-savvy millennial developers versus millennial moms, right? They're all millennials, but the brand needs are different, the insights are different, the creative is going to be different, the ROI that everyone's looking to get out of this thing is different. So I think the important part is that there's a process that you want to be as thorough as possible and be as creative as possible, but everybody and everything is different every time.
One thing that we notice is that millennials really like to be involved in a campaign. So at Heartbeat, we basically, will identify millennials that, make sense to promote a brand. So let's say, working with Beachbody. So we'll reach out and find a bunch of millennial women in our network that are interested in fitness. One thing that we've noticed is when we do, so we'll ask them to post on Snapchat, to post on Instagram, any type of social media that they want. We're pretty platform agnostic, and I think giving them choices is one thing that we always look to do universally, and then also getting them involved in their own way. So we'll go to them and say, hey, we would love you to post about Beachbody and how much you love that brand, but you do it in your own way. You post about yourself and your experience with it, and they love that participatory thing, because they're way more likely to do if it is authentic than if it is something that's very contrived, or if we just sent them a picture to post. They would not like that. And we find that our most successful campaigns are the ones that are driven by that authenticity and participatory nature.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think the buzzword would be authenticity, and ensuring that ultimately your brand value proposition is in line with that authenticity and how that's being actually translated through your marketing materials. Another example that could be through the use of personas. So we actually conducted a brand study fairly recently, and what we found out was that actually our target demo had shifted. 10, 15 years ago, it was a much younger demographic, from roughly 13 to 23. As the brand has matured, it's actually gotten a bit older, so now it's maybe 25 to 35 as a primary, and then secondary and tertiary and so forth. And so what we've done is then aligned the data around that research to create these personas around Susie, who lives in Silver Lake, and she's on brand and shops at thrift stores and American Apparel and da-da-da-da-da, but have really segmented out our consumer into these personas, and then we really follow the methodology of test and learn. And so we test everything, in multiple dimensions, essentially, to see what is the most effective, but I will say wholeheartedly that it comes down to the authenticity of the voice.
So as a follow-up to that, you're saying that it's starting to skew a little older now. Are those the original customers that have just aged, or are you bringing in a new set of people at that age group?
I'd say there's definitely a lot of older customers that were one-time, major shoppers that have definitely aged. And so that's part of the challenge, is how do you then reinvigorate, that younger demographic, which is what we're working towards today. That's
That's fascinating. So In 2015, Hotwire PR stated that in 2016, marketing content will target passion, not be number-driven, and will be age agnostic. So we're halfway through 2016. Was Hotwire right? Kate, let's start with you.
Sure. I think marketing should have been and has always been passion-driven. Good marketing is based on a strong consumer insight. That has not changed. I think principles of marketing are the same if the platforms are different, if the technology is different, but that will always be true. If you can't find something that your consumer is passionate about, you won't make the sale. So I think that's always going to be true. I think that content for millennials is data-driven, even if it's not coming from them, even if they don't know it is. Everything that Snapchat is doing is completely driven by the data that they're seeing and the trends that they're seeing and the patterns that they're seeing. And then, I think 2016 is not that different in terms of all of these trends, but yeah. What was the third piece? Passion.
Age agnostic.
Age agnostic. Yeah, I think that's I think as you're saying, it's not necessarily the age, but it might be the stage of life, or it might be your interests or your passions. But I do think that there are trends among millennials that are different from baby boomers and things like that. We can't ignore that, but I wouldn't say age agnostic entirely.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the questions framed like there are these competing interests between passion and data. I think the easiest way, from our perspective, the easiest way to look at that is it's about loyalty, right? At the end of the day, it's about what does it take to create loyalty. Brand love, brand love translates to loyalty. And how you keep that and retain it and grow it, and then turn your consumers into evangelists. And that's the intersection between passion and spirit, and the data that allows you to make decisions and double down on things that are working, and cut bait when things aren't. Because these are the methodologies that equate to loyalty. And you start to see this pop up. You see all these different companies and brands that are jumping on the loyalty bandwagons and trying to figure out what their loyalty programs are, and how do they incentivize the sharing in social, and how do they incentivize the conversion, when somebody buys something, how do they get them to then come back for more. So I think that's from and then the other part of that is it's always been the strategy, right? Like the good marketing, good content, whether it's an IP and an audience or a product and a consumer, loyalty has always been the intention, right? It's always been what you creatively try to strive for. But I think where we're at now, because of data and because of technology and because of social, you have the ability to productize loyalty and actually turn it into a mechanic that's repeatable in a much more easier fashion than you ever could before.
Yeah, as a data scientist, I think to say that the data is not useful is completely misinformed. To the prior point, we have more data than we've ever had, like in the history of the world at this time today, and that's only growing exponentially. I think the major challenge within organizations is showing value from that data and driving action from that data. In retail in general, I don't know, how many people work in retail here? Okay, not too many. It's a very emotional industry. Prior to American Apparel, I was at Fox and entertainment and and I've worked in retail in the past, and in general, people are just very emphatic around the brand and the passion and so on and so forth. And the way I've been able to kind of cut through that is actually through the use of data. And so the way, when I first actually joined American Apparel, we had no analytics, we had no testing, and those were two of the first platforms that I implemented. So I did a full Adobe Analytics implementation, and I used Maximizer for A/B and multivariate testing. And my point is, when I went to the creative team, at first they're like, oh my gosh, we're going to do testing. But it's actually an opportunity for them to be more creative, because instead of them giving me one version, they give me 5, and then we optimize against, ultimately, the interest of the consumer. And so I just think it's absolutely crucial to be data-centric in the overarching strategy.
So I want to circle back on something that was touched on in the earlier question, that there was a social content platform that was directed to millennials, which will remain nameless, but they conducted a study that concluded that when brands use abbreviations like LOL, YOLO, and FOMO, they lose the millennial audience because they might not be coming across as authentic. So, Kate, I know you mentioned authenticity. So what does a brand have to do to actually be authentic?
I think there's nothing worse a brand can do than say FOMO if it's not actually in your brand voice. So I think having a consistent and defined brand voice is really, really important. So if your brand wouldn't say that, don't say that. And I think you actually also have to evolve with your audience and let them tell you. So I'm 31, but I know I'm on the higher end of the millennials. So we actually work with women who are in college to kind of let us know how they speak. We kind of run copy through them, and there's just a sense of humility that I have to have every day and say, I don't know how these kids talk. We actually had a slang coolness meeting last week. I'm not joking, because we actually will say, be one of we call them our bays, our brand ambassadors extraordinaire. And that's something that people say, like, oh, you're my bae, but that term is actually becoming a little bit outdated. So we've been deciding, do we move away from that? Is it authentic for us to say that anymore? So we actually just listen to them. And that's the coolest thing about our company is, like, we have 20,000 women who are just kind of there to tell us what they think. And so I think having that dialogue and speaking with your consumer the same way you would in a focus group or things like that back in the day, like, that's just the most important thing to understand if your brand voice is authentic.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, it's the key to any good relationship, right? Whether it's, your partner at home or whether it's your person you're working with across the table, you got to listen. What do we know? If you're a brand and you're a storyteller and you're trying to connect with an audience, going back to the data science over here, there's plenty of stuff there. There's plenty of data there. Listen to your customer. Listen to them. They'll give you the rails. They'll give you everything you need if you're willing to listen, and then you can take that data, you can take that subjectivity that they're giving you, which is hopefully positive, and you can turn it into something that's usable, that's aligned with your brand. But you got to listen. The first thing you ever have to do is shut up and listen.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than a brand trying to be cool when they're definitely not. And I think using like outdated. I mean, by the time you see a term like LOL in an ad, it's definitely not cool. Again, it comes back to that authenticity.
And emoji. Let's just all stop using emoji.
Immediately.
Well, the emoji thing is really interesting, right? So the insight being that a year or so ago, the younger you got, the more people were communicating with visuals as opposed to words, right? And at this point, it's starting to become like a little bit, but it's still okay. And you saw like Deadpool, the movie Deadpool, which just annihilated the box office. But did you guys see the billboards that it was emojis? Like, there was no Deadpool branding, there was no Marvel branding, it was just emojis. And it was great because it was a year and a half ago now at this point, 2 years ago at this point. That was their audience. That was the character, right? It was the audience aligned with the character brand, and the marketing spoke to that. And it did it in a way that, I remember driving down the road and I'm a huge comic book geek, but I definitely wasn't super familiar with Deadpool. And I was like looking at it, and my 7-year-old in the back, he was like, "Oh, Dad, it's a new Deadpool sign, look at it." My 7-year-old. He knew exactly what that was. So whoever did the marketing for that campaign, they listened, and they aligned it with the brand, which was very much that, and they did a great job, and it paid off in the box office. Nowadays, I don't know if Deadpool 2 should use emojis. I don't know.
Okay, and just be careful about using emojis. They can be copywritten. Talk to your lawyer. So Viacom has a proprietary measurement tool called the Echo Social Graph that's all about sentiment analysis. So they track social comments in part with a social tech platform, Canvas, CANVS, which measures 56 different emotions for that sentiment analysis. According to Viacom sales chief, of the 56 different emotions, the number one emotion sought is brand love. What do you guys think about that?
Yes.
Among marketers, the number one emotion sought is brand love. That makes total sense to me. But is that the number one emotion that, the consumers exhibit? Or, that's the question. Like, of course we want everybody to love our brand, but I think a tool needs to be designed with the consumer in mind, not the marketer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little vague. I'd have to see the data before I ultimately made a decision there. Sentiment analysis, I think, is interesting. It can be a good indication of, how happy your customers are or not. But I would be curious to see how it correlates to revenue, lifetime value, and so forth.
See, that's because a content guy wrote the question, not a data analytics guy, right? Okay, so despite constant reports that Facebook is dying, and it isn't cool for teens and young adults, the social platform allegedly reaches the most millennials. Do you guys think this is valid? I mean, is Facebook, I mean, we know it's, 1 billion people on Facebook, but in terms of the demographic that we're talking about here, does it remain valid?
No way. Absolutely not. All the kids are on Snapchat. And I see this in the numbers and the social engagement. I mean, they're still on Instagram, but even there, and as Instagram also now has a algorithmic optimized feed, essentially, they're even migrating off Instagram. So I believe it's entirely Snapchat.
I disagree, but
Ooh.
I admittedly used to work for Facebook. So I think they're not migrating off Facebook, they're migrating their engagement off Facebook, and I think that's the distinction. Facebook is still the most used social platform among millennials and among Generation Z globally, hands down. Especially in the developing world, it remains a very important tool, and still in the US as well. What we're seeing is that they're not engaging with it in the way that they used to, and that the way that they are with the newer platforms like Snapchat. So they are on Facebook, it's almost like a must-have. It's like the same way you guys probably use your LinkedIn. You have to be on it in order to kind of be relevant. And they use it for, school events. We use Facebook quite a bit, but we don't ever ask our millennial women to post about things on Facebook because they'll look at us like we were crazy. But they love posting on Snapchat. They love posting on Instagram because that's where they communicate about their personal beliefs and values. Facebook is no longer that tool. It's more like a database or kind of like a life organizer, but they are absolutely on Facebook and use it. I think it's that they spend 26 hours a month on Facebook. If anybody was spending 26 hours a month with your brand, you would think it was really important. So don't ignore Facebook, but definitely it's the engagement that's migrating away, not the people.
Doesn't Facebook own Snapchat?
Facebook owns Instagram.
Instagram. Instagram.
Got it. No, I think it boils. Here's the hard part, right? The hard part is that the thing is framed in the context of an either-or conversation, but what we're really talking about is a yes-and conversation. So yes, Facebook, and Snapchat, and Instagram, and wherever else your people are, right? It goes back to who are your people, where are they, what are they doing, and then what are you trying to get them to do back? Like, what's the activation? What's the ROI? What's the point of your energy? And based on all that, you'll start to get aligned with, okay, well, my point is I need video views because I'm doing X, Y, or Z. Or, oh no, really, I need to build a business pipeline of email lists. And it's all contingent on what you're trying to achieve, and then you go to where you do that best.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the product too. I have a good friend who is working on a new product for AIG, kind of boring insurance, but in general, that's going to reach an older demographic, and I would totally recommend Facebook. But in terms of what we've seen in the data around our younger audiences, it's absolutely not there. And we see it in the numbers and the migration. And we're starting to quantify now, for instance, on Snapchat, when we do a promo, we'll use a unique promo code so we can actually tie it back to a return.
So one thing, we don't have a lot of time. There's a couple of questions I want to make sure we get in. So how vital is mobile to a millennial campaign?
It's crucial, I think.
The most important thing.
What happens if you haven't planned for it?
Then you're not in a real conversation.
Although I would caution, when you say mobile, are you talking about responsive? Are you talking about native? And are you building iOS and Android? When I joined American Apparel, that was a pivotal question to my board, and they're like, okay, are you, building a mobile app? And because we had not really optimized our mobile responsive environment and experience, my major focus was on mobile responsive specifically. Secondarily, and I ask all you guys, how many mobile apps do you have on your phone that you actually use? And you may have 50, you maybe use like 5 in general, is what I've heard at a number of conferences. And so I think it is absolutely integral to your to your overarching strategy, but ultimately it depends on how you want to reach those consumers. That 2 cents.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Every time you ask anybody to do anything, you're asking a lot. So really, it's what's the value proposition? So where are you going to spend money? You're going to spend money on HTML5 responsive adaptive. You're going to spend money on an app. What are you asking from these people? Because that'll help you make the decisions around where to spend the money, how to spend it, what to build, what not to build. and kind of, it's part of a yes, and part of it's a yes and again, right? Which is, yes, numbers on desktop are declining, but they're still huge. Like, they're not going anywhere, at least for not a long time. And apps are critical, but they're critical because they have a function, right? There's a form and a function that you need those to take over the device, and you need those for for other things. So again, it goes back to what's the insight telling you, and what are you trying to achieve, and then that'll be your roadmap. And all of that, juxtaposed against what's the exchange. You give me a click to the site, and I'll give you this. I'm asking for your email. What am I going to give you for that email? Oh, you're gonna be a brand evangelist. Oh, I can thank you for that in these ways.
What about video? How important is it?
For millennials, I mean, listen, 76% of millennials spend most of their time watching video on YouTube every single day. All the other numbers are declining. YouTube and social video grows by double digits every quarter. It's the only category that does that and has been for the last 10 years. So it's super critical.
Yeah, I agree, and I think video is evolving, right? So the type of video that a brand might have done 30 years ago is totally different from what it is today. There's a lot of consumer-generated video. We work with our ambassadors to create videos in 30 minutes. They can turn things around for us. So I think the video has to be relevant, but it also has to be quick. It has to be timely. It has to speak their language. So I think you can't just say mobile is important, video is important. The right video, the right content, the right messaging, that still remains really important.
Darn.
Yep, so we deploy video as part of an omni-channel marketing conversation. So we'll take a campaign, most recently we had bodysuits, and within bodysuits we amplified it on the social front within Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat, and we had a video clip that was also socialized throughout all those networks, as well as programmatic and display and so on and so forth. So absolutely integral. I mean, one question I have is, is it still as important within like YouTube as an example? And as we see MCNs kind of wind down, what does that look like in the future of video? But it's absolutely integral to the overarching conversation.
Okay, so is there anything, can a video be too short? Right? I've read that, your videos have to be fairly to the point, be very quick, but is there something is too short?
12 to 15 seconds, I think that's optimal.
It's kind of a sweet spot?
Well, that's the Instagram cutoff is 15 seconds, but we've actually even seen 12 seconds to be more effective.
Depends on the audience.
Yeah, it depends on the audience, and I agree. If you guys if you're not on Snapchat, get on Snapchat. It's really important to understand the platform for millennials. But Snapchat's really interesting because you can do a series of 12 one-second videos and craft a cool narrative. So it's not necessarily the length, but understanding the medium, understanding how to use it in cool ways, but you can also do something that's too long on Snapchat. Some brands will just do story after story after story after story, and it gets really annoying to watch. But there's people who are doing really interesting things with video on Snapchat that are awesome brands to watch. So definitely kind of watch Snapchat for what's going on in brand videos.
Yeah, Everlane in particular, I think they're
awesome.
A really good job across the board, but they have nearly daily post on Snapchat, all video, and it's a really engaging conversation around what's going on in their product line and people in the office, and again, very authentic voice.
Well, that was going to be, we've got time for just one more really quick question, and I wanted to ask each of you, name a brand or brands that are killing it with reaching the millennial target.
This is cliche, but Taco Bell, they've been doing it really well for a number of years. But they've been really working hand in hand with Snapchat and some of the emerging platforms to make sure that they understand it better than anyone out there. They have a huge budget, recognize that. People will come to me and say, who's doing it well? And I'm like, okay, this person who has millions and millions of dollars to spend. Okay, but they're really creative and they take risks. And I think taking risks with those emerging platforms is important because, you can't fail that hard right now on Snapchat. So I would say Taco Bell.
Listen, I think Snapchat's killing it. As a brand, Snapchat
as a brand,
killing it. You take social video, you throw in play science and gamification, and it's crushing.
Yeah, outside of Everlane, I was giving a talk at Wharton last month, and there was I think it was the CMO of Domino's, And I thought he had a very interesting framing where he considers Domino's to be a pizza company wrapped in a marketing company, wrapped in a technology company. And in the last, I don't know, I think 7 years or so, their stock price has gone from $2 to about $150. And part of that has been able to really own the conversation through a multitude of channels, video being one, and they even showed some of their more recent television ads and video ads and the engagement there. So just a brand doing it well, generally, Domino's.
That's
Domino's
great.
app is like one of my favorite apps. It's just cool. It's like you feel really, and I think it taps into this millennial insight, which is probably why I like it, of I feel really involved. So they can like track the progress of ordering your pizza. You can say thank you to the guys who are making your pizza. You have that sense of engagement and participation. So I think that's a great example.
Yeah, you can literally send a tweet and get a pizza delivered to you. I mean,
With an
it's
emoji.
Amazing, yeah, like with an emoji.
That's just too easy. Okay, so I have to put my MC hat back on, and I need to bring the panel to a close. But thank you all so much for coming down today. I'd love for this to continue. I think it's great, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come down and provide some education. Thank you so much.